The enemy structure bar in SIFU is one of the most important aspects of the game. It's like a stamina bar, and when it maxes out, you can perform a brutal melee takedown for a small bit of health regeneration. But how does this thing work? What affects structure? As far as I know, there aren't any attacks that specifically benefit trying to break structure. A parry will do it, but we're looking at attacks. I spent some time examining the relationship between health and structure damage, and there doesn't appear to be any difference across the moveset. If something does more damage to health, it also does more damage to structure. If two different combos do the same amount of health damage, they'll both also do the same damage to structure. Enemies have different amounts of structure just as they do health, and I've found that most of the time, a consistent assault will lead to enemies dying from structure break before running out of health. Enemies will regain structure if left alone, so make sure you're landing those hits whenever you can. The more takedowns you get, the more you'll stay alive. But be careful because some enemies have the ability to revive and come back much stronger. In time, you'll learn to identify them. Enemy structure regenerates at a speed determined by their health bar. An enemy at high HP will recover their structure very quickly. The more damage they take, the slower it'll be. Here's a side-by-side example showing the bouncer at the club. Performing 3 heavy attacks, the left side bouncer starting from max HP is able to regain his structure in 20 seconds. The right side bouncer starting from about 70% HP takes 36 seconds to regain the same amount of structure. This extends further and further down the health bar until you have a bouncer sitting at 35% that can literally take up to 2 minutes to fully regain his structure. Once the bouncer crosses into 25% health, structure regain is completely stopped until he dies. So enemies have a determined health value, possibly different for all of them, where structure regain becomes impossible. Like your own character, enemies only regain structure when resting. So if they sprint or attack, structure regain pauses. Also, if you land a heavy stun, structure regain will pause if you aren't hitting them. And after a sweep, structure regain pauses as the enemy is waiting for your ground hit. Speaking of heavy stun, I spent a long time trying to see if there's any connection between health values, structure damage, and the ability to land a heavy stun counter. I'm still far from understanding it completely, but speaking with other SIFU players, the consensus seems to be that there's some other third bar that's not being shown to us, keeping track of how much health an enemy has lost within a certain amount of time. Here you'll see me hit the bouncer 6 times and then heavy stun is triggered. Not once in my testing did I get it to trigger when he was above 50% health. I'm not saying that's true for every enemy because enemies have different health values and different points where the heavy stun will trigger. His structure damage was pretty low, so having high structure damage isn't a factor. In another example, we do a fairly damaging combo, and the very next counter hit triggers a heavy stun. Notice that again it's when we cross the 50% line. But heavy stuns on the bouncer aren't simply triggered by an attack that crosses the 50% line. It's just that the next hit has to occur either crossing 50% or already under 50%. Here we're damaging the bouncer with a combo that takes him well under 50, and then the next hit triggers the heavy stun now that we're already past 50. That means you can't overshoot the heavy stun line and miss your opportunity. Depending on the events leading up to it, a heavy stun can be triggered even when he's close to death. I'm also getting the same trigger point around the 50% mark against the museum guard with the blade, so these mid-level goons are pretty much all going into heavy stun around the same point. Low-tier enemies, like the second enemy in level 1 for example, go into heavy stun if you land a counter hit around 20%. The fat guy takes a lot of punishment and then goes into heavy stun around 40%. What makes me certain there's also some kind of timer or cooldown factor to this hidden meter is that I can get someone to the 50% line, and then if I wait a long time, just let him walk around a bit, and then I do my heavy counter, he does not go into the heavy stun state like he should. It actually takes 2 more counter hits to trigger heavy stun. You might think it has something to do with his structure, but I don't think it does. I've created the same situation but with higher structure damage, and the heavy stun still doesn't activate until a couple more hits. So I theorize that there's some kind of meter that keeps track of accumulated damage, and like the structure bar, it has a cooldown. Every increase of damage starts slowly going down. and then it reaches a point where if the enemy is counter hit, heavy stun triggers. But once you're in that range, if you don't find an opportunity to do damage or land a counter hit, the meter will be going down the whole time, eventually leaving the heavy stun zone, and you'll need to get it back up there if you want to trigger it. I think that's what's happening, or something close to it. There's enough evidence to suggest it. Another interesting fact is that this theoretical heavy stun meter doesn't reset after takedown prompts appear. If you don't hit the takedown, the next counterattack will trigger heavy stun, assuming you haven't done that already. In a fascinating turn of events, focus attacks and weapons do not contribute to this heavy stun meter, or if they do, it's very limited. I'm fairly certain of this because if you look at this fight against the mid-tier museum guard, I can get him into heavy stun with conventional fighting around the 50% range. If I throw the bat at him first, he doesn't reach heavy stun until 40%. If I hit him multiple times with the bat, I can't get him to trigger heavy stun until I cross 30%. Against the fat guy in the sanctuary garden, I should be able to heavy stun him at 40%, but throwing a brick at him first means his stun won't activate until 35. This is all fascinating stuff. I love looking at the systems that support a game's combat design, all the small details that are put in place to create the balance of the experience. I hope you found this as interesting as I did. It was quite a lesson today. Variable structure decay and theoretical heavy stun meter. I'm exhausted. You have no idea how much work this took to put together, and I could have gone much further, testing it against even more enemies and trying to find differences with bosses. Someone else take it from here, please. If you like this video on SIFU and you want to support my channel, aside from the obvious like and subscribe, you can check out my merch store and my Patreon. Sometimes I stream on Twitch, and I'll see you next time.